In today's lesson, we're going to talk about Darwin's voyage of discovery. If you would have been given the opportunity to meet a young Charles Darwin, you would have never guessed that his ideas would change the way we look at the world. As a boy, he wasn't a very good student. Yet one day he would come up with one of the most important theories of all time. So, what was his contribution to science? Basically, he developed a scientific theory that helped explain biological evolution and how modern organisms evolved over long periods of time through descent from common ancestors. So, how did his journey begin? He was born in England on February 12th, 1809. He grew up at a time when the scientific view of the natural world was actually shifting. Geologists were beginning to suggest that the Earth was ancient and had changed over time, and biologists were suggesting that life on Earth had done the same thing. The process of change over time is called evolution. Darwin developed a scientific theory that helped explain biological evolution. It shows how modern organisms evolved over long periods of time through descent from common ancestors. This view of the world that we're all pretty familiar with now is just coming about when Darwin is born. In Darwin's 20s, he is invited to sail on the HMS Beagle. It was a 5-year voyage. Their job was to map the coastline of South America. Darwin planned to collect specimens of plants and animals on the voyage. No one knew it, but this would be one of the most important scientific voyages in history. So, what patterns of biodiversity, remember that's the diversity of life, did Darwin note? First, he noticed that different, yet ecologically similar animal species would inhabit separate, but ecologically similar habitats around the globe. And I'm going to explain that here in just a second. He also noticed that different yet related animal species would often occupy different habitats in the same local area. And Darwin also noticed that some fossils of extinct animals were similar to living species. Darwin would fill his notebook with observations about the characteristics and the habitats of the different species he saw. He wanted to explain the biological diversity he observed in a scientific way. He was looking for patterns to which his observations might fit. As he traveled, he noticed 3 distinctive patterns of biological diversity. He noticed that species vary globally, that species vary locally, and that species vary over time. In this picture, you see one of the animals that Darwin noticed that were different yet ecologically similar. What he noticed was that these birds, the American ree, looked a lot like the ostriches that he would see in similar habitats but on a different continent. So what he noticed was that different yet ecologically similar animal species would inhabit very separate but ecologically similar habitats around the globe. So what he noticed were that these large, flightless, ground-dwelling birds that were called rees lived in the grasslands of South America, and they looked and acted a lot like ostriches, which lived in grasslands of Africa. He noticed that the rees, though, only lived in South America, and ostriches only lived in Africa. When Darwin then visited Australia's grasslands later, he found another very large flightless bird called the emu. Something else he noticed that rabbits and other species that lived in European grasslands were not in the grasslands of South America and Australia. Instead, he saw Australia's grasslands had kangaroos, and he didn't see those anywhere else. So what did these patterns of distribution mean? Another pattern he noticed was that species would vary locally. Darwin noticed that different, although related, animal species would often occupy a different habitat within a local area. For example, Darwin found 2 species of rees living in South America, one in Argentina's grasslands and the other in the colder, harsher grass and scrubland to the south. There were some other examples of local variation, and a lot of them came from the Galapagos Islands. They're about 1,000 kilometers off the Pacific coast of South America. These islands are close to one another, yet they have different conditions. Several islands were home to distinct form of giant land tortoises. Darwin saw differences among the tortoises that inhabited the islands and learned from the island's governor that the tortoises' shells varied in predictable ways from one island to another. So let's look a little at these tortoises. The shape of the tortoise's shells actually corresponds to different habitats. Isabella Island, for example, has high peaks. It's really rainy and it has abundant vegetation that is really close to the ground. A tortoise from Isabella Island would have a dome-shaped shell and a short neck because all of the vegetation is near the ground. In contrast, Hood Island is very flat, it's dry, and it has sparse vegetation. A long neck and a shell that is curved and open around the neck and legs will allow the Hood Island tortoise to reach very high for that sparse vegetation. He did not find the Hood Island tortoises on Isabella Island or the Isabella Island on Hood Island. A lot of Darwin's research really came from these particular kinds of mockingbirds. They resembled mockingbirds that he'd seen in South America. In addition, Darwin noticed that several types of small brown birds on the islands with beaks of different shapes. He didn't consider these smaller birds to be unusual or important at first. Something else that Darwin noticed was that species will vary over time. So Darwin was collecting fossils along his way as well. So these are the preserved remains or traces of ancient organisms. Darwin noticed that some fossils of extinct animals were very similar to those that he had seen that are living. On one set of fossils that Darwin found, they belonged to a long, extinct glyptodont, which is a giant armored animal that was very similar to the armadillo. Darwin wondered if the armadillo might be related to the ancient glyptodont. So why had they disappeared, and why did they resemble armadillos? These are all questions Darwin was trying to answer. So he begins to put the pieces of the puzzle together. On the voyage home, he thought about the patterns he'd seen. Darwin sent plant and animal specimens to experts for identification. The Galapagos mockingbirds turned out to belong to 3 separate species found nowhere else. The little brown birds were actually all species of finches, also found nowhere else, although they did resemble the South American finch species. The same was true of Galapagos tortoises, marine iguanas, and many plants that Darwin had collected on the islands. These were found nowhere else. Darwin began to wonder whether different Galapagos species could have evolved from that very close continent of South America. He spent years actively researching and filling notebooks with ideas about species and evolution. His evidence suggested that species are not fixed, which means that they do change, and they could change by some natural process.